We begin to get all of our assets together for our portfolio site. We'll be looking at things based on our goals that were in the questionnaire from week 1. And the idea here is to go after that developer job that you want. And one of the ways to do that is to show that you can code in a dynamic way. And what that means is that when we do a certain program, we should be able to share that code with anybody, and they should be able to dive right in and not have to work too hard to change or make additions to it. So what I'm giving you this week is a form validation dynamic block of code. And the idea is, if you've had WebD 170, you've had the JavaScript course in this curriculum, often we validate by getting the value of a text field with document.getElementById. That's a very important thing here. But what happens when a user or a teammate adds a text field? How do we make that validate? Well, you'd have to pass it to the JavaScript programmer, and that JavaScript programmer would have to add that code that would validate that one part. So what I'm presenting to you is an idea of evaluating by type, not by ID. So here we go. This is the form. It's a typical one that I give out in a lot of my classes. And I use it because it has every type of HTML input. It's got the input type text. It's got radio buttons, checkboxes, a drop down, and a text area. So let's take a good look at this. The goal here is that when we add something, it should automatically be validated. So we do that by not having IDs the way you've probably been taught, but by looping around the document object model and getting each value and evaluating it by type. Once we get it by type, we can understand what type of value should be coming in from that input type. So let's take a look at this code. And on my input type submit, I actually have an on-click return validate form, just a return of the function. And if we go to the top here, you're going to see validate form. So this block of code runs when we hit that button. But what's important here is the var form collection. That equals the document.forms, but 0. That's because there might be more than one form in a document. So right now it's 0. The only thing you'd have to change is if this is the second form, you would put it toward 1 or 2 or 3. So let's console.log this and take a good look at what we're trying to achieve. So I'm going to console.log form collection, just so you can see it. And the idea, again, is to be dynamic. And this should be one of your code pens. And now you see it says name, text input, fields, missing data. And then down here we see this. We see the entire form. This was my console.log. I logged the entire form collection of the first, or 0, form. It's 0 because it's an array. Now here are variables for all my inputs: text, radio, check input, drop, text area. So this is for the name, this is for the radio buttons, this is for the checkboxes, this is for the drop down, this is for the text area. But as we start, all of them are false. Now since we know this is an array, we can loop through it. So what we're doing is looping through the array. I, of course, is just meant to set the loop. And as long as I is less than the form collection.length, we can increase I. So we're going to increase through everything, okay? So now let's console.log the element itself so you get a good idea of what's happening. So each element is form collection I. So it would be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. So let's take a look. I'm going to hit refresh again, save, go back, and now we see enter me. And once the alert box comes down, this is my iteration. Okay, so it's full name, gender, hobbies, show, comments, etc. Now, the submit button's also there. So what we're saying is that let's get everything about each element. So if you look at the attributes right here, we can get every one of these with a property. We can get the type or the name. So let's get the name. So I'm going to do element.name, and let's add a plus, and I'm going to do is, and I'm going to do, oh, we got to remove that dot there, but I'm going to add a plus here, and I'm going to do element.type. Okay. Now let's check it out. So I'm going to hit refresh again, and I'll go ahead and just hit enter me, and we'll get that error, that alert. Now we have full name as text, gender is radio, hobbies is a checkbox, show is select one, comments is a text area, and submit has a type of submit. So what we've done just there is log the fact that we've looped around every element in the form collection. So let's take a look at this. Remember, text input is a variable that's registered as false in line 19. So what we're saying is if that type of element happens to be text, then we test to see is the element dot value not equal to empty, and is the element dot value dot length greater than 0. That means that it has something in there, but the length is also greater than 0, so let's make it true. So let's skip all the others real quick and talk about this. So if I enter something in the text field, which is element type text, then all I have to do is create a message. So in this case, this is the validation. If there's no text input, no radio input, no check input, no drop input, no text area input, then we know there's an issue. One of those. These are ORs. So we're saying if there's no name, no radio group, no check input, no drop input, or no text area input, we have a problem. And these are where we add our dynamic messages. So if no text input, then let's input the text input is missing data. And then we have it with else if, else if, else if, else if, and just a return false. Now notice there's no else here, but the idea is we're going to catch these so the person doesn't get multiple alerts. Remember, the idea is to be dynamic. So basically, if you get in a job interview and you want to talk about how you code, bring this up. And what I'm saying is that another coder could just say, well, I'm going to add some HTML. Well, guess what? Your JavaScript already takes care of it, because we're taking care of things by type, not by anything else. Okay? So this is a good way to go through this. There's ways that it can improve, but I'm going to give you this as a starting point to understand and give you some portfolio pieces that will get you in the discussion about why and how we code the way we do. Let's take a look at the radio buttons. Now, radio buttons, as you may remember, are an array. They're a list of elements. So in this case, we have to look at our collection of radio buttons and say, okay, well, let's loop around all the radio buttons, and if any of them are checked or true, then the radio input is true. So basically, once the radio buttons are checked or true, then it becomes true, and then we can break that loop and move on to the next one. So same with checkboxes. We get the group name, we find the number of checkboxes, and we test to see if any of them are checked. If they are checked, any one of them, then check input would be true. So we wouldn't need to validate that. And this is the dropdown. Believe it or not, the type of the dropdown is actually select-1. We saw that when I just console.logged it. But what we're saying here is that if that value is not equal to empty, then heck, we're going to drop input equal true. And lastly, the text area. We test that to see if the value is empty and the value length is greater than 0. Now, that's an important thing. Now, one thing I'm going to go ahead and change real quick is this. We're going to add a placeholder, because right now the value is going to be more than 0 unless we actually have a placeholder instead. So now I'll go back and I'll hit refresh, and we can run this through a test. So I'll type in Chris, male, I like baseball, football, Aquatine, and now I can hit this, and it says the text area field is still missing data. So that's good. I can hit refresh again, all these would empty, and I can kind of go through each step. Now this could obviously be improved. I'll show you how in a second. But for now, this is something that should be a part of your CodePen, and that's why I'm assigning to you. I want you to experiment with CodePen and get this inside there so it's functional. I hope that makes sense. That way, when a user looks you up online, or a user, an employer, then you'll find that they'll find you and know that you have an interest in form validation. So this would validate the checkboxes. And once I click checkboxes, we can do drop down. There's the drop down. We know the text area works. So take this code and put it in, but I want you to think about how it can be improved. And let me tell you that if you had this as dynamic, because notice how these are This section is not dynamic really because we have name, gender, hobbies, favorite shows, and comments. I want you to think about ways that we can make this dynamic, and we'll talk about this later on in the semester. But for now, let's get things in your GitHub. Let's get things in your CodePen. So this belongs in CodePen.